Vivian sat in the corner of her bedroom, with her knees drawn to her chest as the sound of her parents' voices cut through the walls. It wasn't an argument this time. It was a war again. She buried her head in her arms, trying to block out the accusations and insults that they are throwing at each other. Her home had once been filled with laughter, at least that's how she remembered it. But those memories felt distant, like faded photographs in a dusty album no one bothered to open anymore. Her father, Mark, was a hardworking man who spent long hours at his construction job, only to come home tired and bitter. Her mother, BC, had given up her dreams of becoming an artist to raise Vivian, a sacrifice she often reminded everyone about. Resentment grew like ivy between them, twisting their love into something unrecognizable. Vivian was an only child, a position that left her stranded in the middle of the battlefield. At 16, she had learned how to disappear when things got bad, how to retreat into books, music, or long walks. But lately, disappearing wasn't enough. That night, as the shouting escalated, she slipped out of the house. The streetlights flickered above her as she wandered the quiet neighborhood. She didn't know where she was going, but anywhere felt better than home. Vivian found herself on the porch of Hannah, her closest friend, who welcomed her inside without question. Hannah's family was the opposite of Vivian's, warm, supportive, and always full of life. The way Hannah's parents laughed together felt foreign, almost unreal to Vivian. "You're staying for dinner," Hannah said as she pulls her into the kitchen. Vivian smiled, grateful but uneasy. She couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider, a shadow lingering at the edge of someone else's light. Over the next few weeks, Vivian spent more time at Hannah's house than her own. She helped with chores, played games with Hannah's younger siblings, and soaked in the comfort she desperately craved. But it wasn't enough. Deep down, she still felt empty, a hollow space where love and security should have been. That emptiness made her vulnerable. She met Toby at a neighborhood gathering. He was 22, charming, and confident in a way that made her feel seen. Unlike the boys at school, Toby didn't tease or ignore her. He listened. Their conversations started innocently. They talked about music, dreams, and life. But as the weeks passed, Toby's attention became more intense. He complimented her looks, held her gaze a little too long, and offered rides home after late nights out. Vivian felt special around him, like someone finally understood her. She mistook his interest for love, something she'd been longing for. When he kissed her one evening, she didn't resist. Instead, she leaned into the illusion of safety he offered. But illusions shatter. Toby's influence over her grew, and soon, Vivian's focus shifted entirely. She skipped classes, ignored Hannah's warnings, and let her world revolve around him. What started as affection turned controlling. He isolated her from friends and filled her mind with ideas that blurred the lines between love and dependency. By the time Vivian realized how far she'd fallen, she felt trapped, too ashamed to ask for help, too broken to believe she deserved it. The days blurred into each other as her world shrank. She no longer cared about grades, hobbies, or the future. School felt like a prison, and home was unbearable. Her mind lingered on Toby's words, the promises of love, the reassurances that no one else could understand her the way he did. But cracks began to form in the illusion. Toby's affection came with conditions. He grew possessive, questioning where she went and who she spoke to. When she tried to pull away, he'd remind her of how much she needed him. "You can't survive without me, Vivian," he said during an argument. "You know that." And she believed him. Her friendship suffered. Hannah stopped calling after one too many ignored messages. Rumors began to spread at school. Whispers about Vivian sneaking out late at night, her sudden disinterest in class, and her closeness with an older guy. Her teachers noticed the change, but she brushed off their concern. She told herself she didn't care what anyone thought. Still, the loneliness gnawed at her. Vivian's need for validation didn't fade, it grew. When Toby's attention waned, she sought it elsewhere. She lingered after class, hoping to catch her male teachers alone, mistaking kindness for interest. Mr. Daniels, her literature teacher, noticed her lingering one afternoon. "Everything okay, Vivian?" he asked with a kind but cautious voice. She hesitated before offering a forced smile. "Yeah, I like talking to you. You're easy to talk to." He shifted uncomfortably, but didn't push her away. That small gesture felt like hope, and she clung to it. Over time, her actions became bolder, lingering touches, compliments, and suggestive remarks. But when Mr. Daniels set firm boundaries, her hope crumbled. Her desperation spiraled further. She sought out other boys in school, testing boundaries, hoping someone would make her feel whole. But the emptiness only deepened. By the time Vivian turned 17, her reputation preceded her. She was the girl people whispered about in hallways, the one boys bragged about and girls avoided. She pretended not to care, wearing her reputation like armor, but inside, she was breaking. Late one night, she sat alone in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. Her eyes looked hollow, her face pale. The person staring back was a stranger. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of her choices crushed her. She thought about running away, starting over, but the fear of being alone stopped her. The turning point came the next day when Hannah confronted her. "You need help, Vivian," Hannah said with so much concern in her voice. Vivian lashed out, accusing her of judging and abandoning her. But as Hannah walked away, Vivian realized how wrong she was. That night, she made the first call for help to a therapist Hannah had recommended weeks ago. "I don't know where to start," Vivian said through tears. "You already have," the therapist replied. Vivian sat nervously in the waiting room of the therapist's office. The walls were painted soft blue, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. She traced patterns on the edge of her sleeve, unsure whether she wanted to run or stay. Her therapist, Dr. Kalu, was a woman in her early 40s with a calm, understanding presence. From the first session, she didn't ask Vivian to explain everything. Instead, she let her talk about whatever felt safe. At first, Vivian kept things shallow, as she talked about school, friends, and normal teenage problems. But cracks soon appeared in her defenses. I feel empty all the time," Vivian admitted during one session. "Like, no matter what I do, it's never enough." Dr. Kalu nodded. "That emptiness didn't start recently, did it?" The words hit Vivian harder than she expected. She wanted to deny it, to keep running from the truth, but her voice betrayed her. "No," she whispered. For the first time, she opened up about her parents' fights, their cold indifference, and how she had always felt invisible. She talked about Toby and how his attention had made her feel alive, at least at first. "Sometimes we seek love in places that can't give it," Dr. Kalu said gently. "Because we're so desperate to feel seen." Tears welled in Vivian's eyes as she realized how much of her life had been spent chasing after scraps of affection. Therapy wasn't easy. Each session peeled back another layer of Vivian's pain, forcing her to confront choices she wanted to forget. She began avoiding Toby's calls and texts, though it wasn't without struggle. Part of her still clung to the idea that he cared, but the more she talked with Dr. Kalu, the clearer it became that his control over her wasn't love. At school, she faced the harsh reality of her reputation. Some boys still saw her as an easy target, and the stares from other girls were heavy with judgment. But she wasn't the same girl she was weeks ago. When one of the boys, Derek, cornered her in the hallway, smirking, Vivian didn't shrink back. "I'm not that person anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Derek scoffed, but she turned and walked away while her heart was pounding. It was the first step toward reclaiming her self-worth. While Vivian worked on herself, her parents' fights only worsened. She avoided home as much as possible, but one evening, she found her mother crying at the kitchen table. BC looked up, startled. "I didn't hear you come in." Vivian hesitated. "Are you okay?" Her mother let out a bitter laugh. "I haven't been okay for a long time." For the first time, Vivian saw the cracks in her mother's armor, the exhaustion, regret, and sadness. "Why didn't you leave him?" Vivian asked softly. "I thought staying was better for you." The words hit like a punch. "Better? You thought watching you two tear each other apart was better?" BC flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she began to cry, and to Vivian's surprise, she reached for her daughter's hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It wasn't enough to fix years of damage, but it was the first apology Vivian had ever heard. Later that night, her father tried to talk to her, but Vivian wasn't ready. She needed more time. Vivian clutched her notebook as she walked into Dr. Kalu's office. She had started journaling at the therapist's suggestion, a place to untangle the mess of emotions she struggled to express. "So, how has this week been?" Dr. Kalu asked. Vivian hesitated before opening the notebook. "Better. I mean, not perfect, but better." She read snippets of her entries, small victories like walking past Toby without looking back, speaking up in class, and resisting the urge to seek approval from others. "Those are big steps, Vivian," Dr. Kalu said. "How do you feel about them?" "Scared," she admitted. "Like, what if I mess up again?" Dr. Kalu leaned forward. "Recovery isn't about never messing up. It's about learning how to stand back up when you do." Those words stayed with Vivian. Over the next few weeks, she focused on rebuilding herself, setting boundaries, practicing self-respect, and slowly reconnecting with Hannah. Hannah had been cautious at first, unsure whether Vivian's change was real. But one night, as they sat on Hannah's porch, Vivian finally apologized. "I pushed you away when I needed you most," she said with tears in her eyes. Hannah hugged her tightly. "I never stopped caring." For the first time in months, Vivian felt hope. Vivian's parents noticed the change too. Her mother stopped drinking as much, and her father came home earlier. They weren't fixed overnight, but they were trying. One evening, Mark knocked on Vivian's door. "Can we talk?" he asked. She nodded hesitantly, and he sat down across from her. "I messed up," he began. "Your mom and I both did. We thought we were hiding our problems, but we weren't. We made this house a war zone, and we didn't see what it did to you." Vivian wanted to scream, to tell him it was too late. But instead, she asked, "Why now? Why do you care now?" "Because I saw what almost losing you looked like," he said. "And I don't want to lose you." For the first time, she saw him as more than just the angry man she had grown up fearing. She saw his guilt and his regret. It didn't erase the past, but it was a start. School slowly became less of a battlefield. She began focusing on her studies again, though catching up wasn't easy. She joined a support group for teenagers dealing with emotional neglect and unhealthy relationships. The group meetings were raw and uncomfortable at first, but hearing others share their struggles made her feel less alone. During one session, she spoke about Toby for the first time. "I thought he loved me," she said. "But he just made me feel like I wasn't enough without him." The group leader, a college student who had recovered from a similar past, responded gently. "Love doesn't make you feel small," she said. "It makes you feel free." Those words lingered with Vivian as she continued her journey. One morning, as Vivian stood in front of the mirror, her reflection no longer a stranger. She wasn't completely healed. She knew recovery wasn't a straight path, but she no longer felt defined by her past mistakes. That didn't mean the world around her had changed as quickly. At school, whispers still followed her. Boys still tried to test her boundaries, and there were days when the temptation to slip back into old habits was strong. One afternoon, Toby showed up outside her school. "You can't ignore me forever," he said, leaning casually against his car. Vivian froze for a moment. The pull of old emotions threatened to overwhelm her, but she took a deep breath and stepped closer. "No, Toby," she said firmly. "I'm done." He laughed, but she didn't waver. "I'm worth more than this." She walked away, her heart pounding but her resolve intact. That moment became a turning point, a reminder that strength wasn't about never falling but about refusing to stay down. At home, Vivian's parents were working through their own struggles. They started attending counseling sessions, learning how to communicate without tearing each other down. One night, BC knocked on Vivian's door. "I wanted to show you something," she said, holding out a canvas. It was the first painting she'd done in years, a vibrant sunset over the ocean. Vivian smiled. "It's beautiful, Mom. It feels good to create again," BC admitted. "And it feels even better to be trying." Mark joined them a few minutes later, setting down a tray of cocoa. It was awkward, but it was real. For the first time in years, their family shared a moment of peace. Later, as Vivian sat in bed, she realized how far they had all come. The scars were still there, but they were learning how to heal together. Graduation day arrived faster than Vivian expected. She stood in her cap and gown, staring out at the crowd. Her parents were sitting together, smiling, and Hannah was waving excitedly. When her name was called, Vivian walked across the stage, each step echoing the journey she had taken to get there. After the ceremony, Hannah pulled her aside. "You did it." Vivian laughed. "We did it." As the crowd began to clear, Vivian lingered for a moment, looking out at the horizon. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't running anymore. She was ready to stand tall, face her past, and create a future she could be proud of. And as she walked toward her waiting family and friends, she knew one thing for certain. She was finally free.